We have this concept in child development psychology where we've created steps of the development of the child's brain, and where we've created the idea of certain experiments and experiences that children have to go through in order to get to the next kind of step, in order to make that neural connection, right? So in practice, what we do, I have a different approach, but what we do in kindergarten and in school is this idea of having the child experience all these things that create the precondition for the connections that promote a healthy childhood brain development. So we kind of compartmentalize these steps and invented different experiments or experiences like walking barefoot in sand, in order to get a kind of sensory experience that develops your brain, that if you hadn't had that experience, there would be something lacking within the connections in your brain. So this is how we think about it. If you run your hands through a box of kind of cherry pits, that you get a sensation that your brain can recognize and can endure. And if you haven't done that enough, that will feel weird. If you're an adult doing that, that will feel strange, and your brain will not have developed in this ideal fashion of, expanding these sensory, the sensory experience that promotes this development in your brain. This is how we think of things, right? Now, I personally think we can improve this. I'm not completely in favor of this. I think a lot of this idea is a legacy of John Locke, is a legacy of Rousseau, even. It's a legacy of Pestalozzi and these past pedagogues that thought you could kind of take in the basic experiences and then you can develop your brain that way. You can make a whole week in kindergarten about a triangle, and then everyone is cutting out a triangle, drawing a triangle, filling in a triangle, finding different triangles. And once you've done that repetitively for a whole week, the child will have this experience of the triangle in their minds, and so they can use this concept later on. This is I think that's extremely boring for the children, or relatively boring. It depends on how much it's about play and social interaction and singing. But frankly, I think that's not necessary in order to learn what a triangle is. I think it's a bit strange that we still do it this way, right? But it has its own, history of pedagogical thought behind it, going to some degree all the way back to John Locke's theory of empirical knowledge, empiricism. Really, it's not an updated version of the problem-solving approach of Bacon and Popper, or at least the hypothesis-centered kind of model of Karl Popper's philosophy of science or whatever. And I'm more inclined to think that if we apply that, we would be much further in our ideas about how we teach kindergarten and primary school. We would look at more complex things and more kind of things that catch the child where they're at, and the child can really be interested in something. And because what we've done is, with this compartmentalization, I think, is that we've made these acts of feeling and of doing a kind of into ends in themselves, from the child's perspective at least. We as educators know this is going to lead to further brain development or whatever. this is not an end in itself. This is for the intelligence, the benefit of the child, right? But I think we, you know, if you go through this as a school child or as a kindergarten child, like realize, you must realize this child is seeing these exercises as ends in themselves in the moment. Like, this is what they're spending their life doing. And then if a child dies at 8, I don't wish it upon anyone, but like, this will be their life. This will be what they have been taught and learned, and this is what they've learned to appreciate about the experience at school, right? I find that a kind of fucked up, kind of weird, that we don't actually make much more meaningful kind of thing. It's difficult to do something meaningful at school. It really is difficult. You have all these different levels of children, and it gets more difficult later on. It doesn't get easier to teach a third grade class than it does to teach a kindergarten classroom, right? And also, if there's fewer children, doesn't mean you can do something much more meaningful than if there are many. It really depends on the children, and it also depends on you as a teacher, like what your ability. Even if you're trying to do something meaningful, it might not work. The children might not be able to be engaged, right? Now, what about cults? What about children being brought up by parents who are in a cult? Can we think of this as inhibiting a kind of sensory or a mental experience in their brain development? What is the school's and the kindergarten's role in doing, something against this? If you have a child from Scientology or a child from Jehovah's Witnesses who have very restricted freedom of information, who are taught all kinds of crazy things at school, like, you're saving the world by believing in this doctrine, right? And then explaining like the whole weirdness of it, yeah. Stopping children from experiencing challenge, intellectual challenge, from experiencing rejection of worldviews, from coming to terms with factual disassociations with what they believe, in order to challenging them in what they think is true. There have been studies done about children's development, how they cannot later in life discern between as easily between stories that are completely fanciful, made up, and stories that are actually true, if they have had a very strong religious upbringing, a very, mind, what's the word? Brainwashed religious upbringing, right? So can it be considered it's a kind of mutilation to the child's brain not to be developed further in this way, right? The child, if it doesn't experience the cherry pits and these tiny sensory experiences that's supposed to develop your brain, how much worse they're not able to have a mature brain development, a mature experience later on in life, what it is to think critically as an adult, what it is to recognize reality as it is, If you circumcise a little girl, female genital mutilation is what we call it. This girl will not be able to have any mature sexual experience when they're an adult. Any. Okay, maybe this is exaggerated, but frankly, like an actual mature sexual experience involving their sexual organs, primary sexual organs, involving orgasm, involving masturbation, involving sex of any kind will not be possible, right? And not mutilating your children's genitalia is not, I mean, of course it's not an end in itself, right? It's not comparable to what I've said before, right? But in this way, if you're not bringing your child up, or if you're not at school challenging a child intellectually who's brought up in a cult, it's much like female genital mutilation. You won't be able to have a mature mental, a mature intellectual life once you become an adult.